The first thing wrong was the dogs in the kennel run, going quiet all at once, the way a porch light cuts when the power drops. Carl Vesper stood at the back door at 4 a.m, with a thermos in one hand and his boots half laced, and he listened to that silence the way another man might stare at a wound. 2 beagles and a redbone, and not one of them so much as scratched a board. He had run hounds in those bottoms for 30 years. He knew every sound they made and every reason they made it, and he had never once heard them go. Still like that, all three between one breath and the next. He set the thermos on the rail and stepped out into the cold. The river fog had come up over the bottoms in the night, and it lay along the low ground in long, pale ropes between the sycamores. Frost on the truck windshield, frost on the kennel wire. His breath went out in front of him and hung there. He clicked his tongue soft. The call the redbone always answered, and the redbone did not answer. He could see the dog in the run, a darker shape against the dark, and the dog was standing dead center of the concrete pad, with its head down and its body turned toward the tree line, and it would not look at him. Carl was 61 years old, and he did not spook. He had pulled drowned men out of the White River in flood years, and he had set his own broken finger with a pair of fence pliers and a strip of duct tape. And he did not invent things in the dark to scare himself. He stood in the frost, and he tried the ordinary explanations one at a time, the way he tried keys on a ring. A coyote working the field edge, a coon up a tree, the neighbor's mule down the road carrying on. None of them fit. A coyote would have set the beagles off, not shut them down. The dogs weren't quiet because there was nothing out there. They were quiet because there was something, and it was something they had decided not to argue with. He had lived on that 20 acres at the lip of Sycamore Bottoms since he was a young man, since before his wife passed and his son moved up to Indianapolis and stopped coming down except at Christmas. The land ran from his back fence down a shallow grade, through old-growth sycamore and box elder, to where the slough went still and black against the river. People called it the Bottoms like it was one thing, but it was 100 things. A floodplain that drowned every spring and dried to cracked gumbo every August, full of deer and turkey and the kind of dark that did not thin out until you were most of the way back up the grade toward the house. He knew it. The way you know a room you have stood in your whole life. That was why the morning bothered him. The room had a new thing in it, and he could not see what. He went back inside, and he did not run his trot line that morning, and he did not take the hounds out. He told himself it was the cold. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee going cold in his hand, and he watched the tree line until the fog burned off. And the fog burned off and showed him nothing at all, just wet timber and the slough catching a little gray light, and that was almost worse. He had wanted to see the reason. There was no reason to see. By 8, the dogs were themselves again, loud and stupid and glad, slamming against the wire when he came out with the feed bucket. He crouched at the run and ran his hand over the redbone's head, and the dog leaned into him, and he felt along its ribs out of an old habit, checking, and the dog was fine. Nothing on it. No blood, no quill, no tick of injury. Whatever had stood out there in the night had not touched the dogs. It had only made them understand something. And the dogs had understood it faster and more completely than Carl had, and that was the part he carried back up to the house with him. Turning it over, not liking the shape of it. The next thing came 2 nights later, and it came as a smell. Carl had gone down to the slough at last, light to pull his trot line. Walking the deer trail he had walked 10,000 times, the redbone at his heel because the dog had pestered him at the door until he relented. The light was going copper through the timber. He smelled the river first, that flat mineral smell of cold water and mud, and under it the rot of the year turning, leaves going down. Ordinary smells. Then he came around the big leaning sycamore where the trail bent toward the water, and the air changed. It was a heavy smell, low and rank, and it was not skunk, and it was not the sweet gas of a deer gone dead in the brush. It was closer to a wet dog, left to spoil a thick animal musk, with something turned and sour worked all the way through it, and it sat in the back of his throat and would not leave. The red bone stopped dead on the trail, not crouching. Standing, stiff-legged, its hackles up in a ridge from shoulder to tail, and a low sound coming out of it that Carl had only heard twice before in the dog's life, both times with a man on the property who meant harm. He stood very still. He was a hunter, and the woods had gone wrong around him. In a way, his body understood before his mind caught up. There was no birdsong. He had not noticed it leave. The slough that should have been loud with frogs in the last warm spell of the fall was silent, and the silence had a size to it, like the quiet in a barn when something large is standing in the dark of it holding its breath. He did not call out. Calling out was for men who thought they were alone and wanted company. Carl did not think he was alone. He backed up the trail the way he had come. He did not turn his back on the bend in the trail, and he did not hurry, because hurrying was how you fell. And he kept one hand on the red bone's collar, and the dog came with him, stiff and unwilling, dragging its feet, wanting to face the thing, and wanting nothing to do with it. Both at once. The smell thinned as they climbed. By the time they reached the fence, it was gone, and the frogs were singing again behind them down at the water, and the ordinary world had closed back over the place like water, over a dropped stone. He left the trot line in the river. He did not go back for it for 9 days. That night he sat up late at the kitchen table with the .30 -30 leaned in the corner where he could reach it, and he made himself think it through. He had a way of working a problem that came from a lifetime of machines and weather and animals, which was to lay out what he knew for certain, and refuse to add anything to it that he could not stand behind. He had it in the back of his throat, still faint, hours later. The dog's reaction was real, and the dog did not lie and could not be talked out of what it had smelled. And the red bone was asleep now, under the table, with its chin on Carl's boot and its legs twitching, working at something in its sleep that Carl did not think was a rabbit. Something large and rank had been standing near the bend in the trail, at dusk. He wrote that much on the inside cover of a seed catalog with the stub of a pencil. Then he sat and he tried to put a name to it. Bear, he thought. And he sat with that for a while. Because it was the explanation a reasonable man reached for. And he wanted to be a reasonable man. Indiana had black bear again, a few drifting up out of Kentucky and across the Ohio. And there had been one shot by a car over in Crawford County 2 years back, and another seen up near Bloomington. A young male pushed out of his home range could travel a long way and could carry a stink, especially in the fall, with the fat coming on. He almost let himself have it. He turned the kitchen light off and sat in the dark with it, trying it on. Then he thought about the dogs in the kennel 2 nights before, a quarter mile from the slough, going silent at 4 a.m, and a bear did not work that way. A bear was a loud and stupid and hungry thing, God love it, and it blundered and ate and left sign a 6-year-old could read. Scat full of corn and persimmon seeds, claw marks raked down a tree, a trash can knocked flat. This had come up the grade to the kennel without leaving a single track Carl had found, and he had looked on his hands and knees in the frost he had looked. It had stood and studied his dogs until all 3 of them surrendered. It had gone back down to the water. And it had been waiting at the bend 2 nights later. At the exact hour the light went, as if it kept a schedule. And the schedule had Carl's land on it. He took the bare explanation down off the shelf, and he turned it over, and he held it up to what he knew, and it did not cover the facts. And he put it back. It did not sit any easier than the coyote had. He sat in the dark a long time after that, and did not reach for another one because he had run out of the kind of name a reasonable man could say out loud. He drove into town the next morning to the county building, because that was what you did when there was an animal on your land that you could not account for. It was a 40-minute drive up out of the bottoms and onto the flat farm country, past the grain elevator and the shuttered cannery, and he spent the whole of it deciding how to say the thing so that it would be believed, and he could not find a way, because every way he tried it in his head came out sounding like the thing it was. Which was a story a man tells when the bottoms have gotten into him. He sat across a metal desk from a conservation officer, a heavy-set younger man named Pruitt, with a department patch and a coffee gone skinned over in a paper cup, and Carl laid it out flat the way he laid everything out, no embroidery, the dogs going silent in the kennel, the smell at the bend in the trail, the red bones hackles, the absence of bird song, and the absence of tracks where there should have been tracks. He kept the worst of it back. He did not yet have the camera photo. He gave the man only what a man could give without sounding addled, and even that was too much. He watched Pruitt's face do the thing he had known it would do. The polite settling, the little downward motion at the corners of the mouth that was not quite a smile, the decision made early and quietly behind the eyes, that this was an old man who lived alone in the bottoms and had spooked himself in the fog. Carl had worn that look on his own face across a tavern table at men telling tall ones. He knew it from the inside. He knew there was nothing he could say that would move it. Probably a bear, Pruitt said. We've had a couple come up across the river. Big boar bear, the smell on one. One of those'll knock you down, I thought of that. Carl said, It's not a bear. A bear leaves sign. Ground's froze, though. Pruitt turned the coffee cup a quarter turn on the desk and did not drink it. Hard to read a track on froze ground. I've read track on froze ground 60 years, Carl said, and he said it without heat, which was the only way he knew to say a thing he meant, and he watched it not land. Pruitt wrote nothing on the pad in front of him. He said he would have somebody swing out and take a look if they got a free afternoon, which Carl understood to mean no. He said the bottoms were full of sounds that carried funny in the river fog, which was true, and which was not the thing Carl had come about. He said all the reasonable things. And they were the same reasonable things Carl had said to himself at his own kitchen table 2 nights running. And that was the whole trouble with them. A reasonable man could not help Carl, because the trouble was that the reasonable explanations had already failed. One after another, every one Carl owned. And here was a young man in a warm office handing them back to him as if Carl had not already tried each one. He drove home knowing that no one was coming, and knowing too that he could not blame them for it, and the two understandings together left him more alone than if the man had laughed in his face. A laugh he could have answered. This he could not. He stopped at the hardware on the way out of town and stood in the aisle a while, and he bought a 100-watt motion light and a box of shells and a trail camera and a blister pack, the cheap kind off a peg by the register, and the boy who rang him up asked if he was after deer, and Carl said he was because that was easier than the truth and because it was on in its way. Not entirely a lie. He drove the 40 minutes back down into the bottoms with the bag on the seat beside him, and he set all of it up that afternoon along the fence, at the head of the deer trail where the land tipped down toward the slough, the light wired to the porch circuit, the camera strapped to the leaning sycamore at the height of a man's chest. aimed down the trail into the dark of the timber. The camera caught nothing for 3 nights. Deer, a possum, the white blur of a barn owl crossing low. He scrolled through the little frames each morning at the kitchen table with his glasses down his nose, and he almost let himself believe it had moved on, whatever it was, the way wild things did, here and gone and never explained. On the 4th morning, the camera had 41 photos on it from a single 40-minute span between 2 and 3 in the morning, and the first 40 were empty fence and empty trail, the motion sensor tripping on nothing he could see over and over. The 41st photo was not empty. It was not a clear picture. He told himself that first, and he held on to it. The flash had fired and washed the near brush bone white, and dropped the trees behind into pure black, and at the right edge of the frame, half out of it, low to the ground and turned away, was a haunch. That was the only word he had for it. A hindquarter matted dark, the muscle of it heavy under the hide, and a length of leg coming down to where it left the frame, and the leg was wrong. The joint sat too high. The proportion of it ran long, where a dog's leg ran short, and the foot, what he could see of the foot at the very edge of the white, was set down flat and broad and too large, and he could not make it be a dog, and he could not make it be a bear, though it had something of all 3 in it and belonged to none. He sat with the little screen, and he did not move for a long time. Then he zipped the camera into a freezer bag, the whole thing, and put it in the chest freezer in the mudroom, the way you would bag evidence, because some part of him had already understood that he was building a case no one would ever try. He started staying up. He was a man who had risen at 4 his whole life, and now he turned it around and slept in the afternoon, and sat the back window through the dark hours, with the rifle across his knees. He kept a notebook, a carpenter's pencil, the cardboard-backed kind he used for figuring lumber. He wrote down times. He wrote down what the dogs did and when. He was not a fanciful man, and the notebook steadied him, gave the nights a shape, and reading back over it later was the first time he understood the pattern, because the pattern was the most frightening thing of all. It was coming closer to the house by stages, and it was doing it on a schedule. The first week it had stayed down at the water. The second week the smell reached the kennel run twice, and the dogs went to ground in their houses and would not come out. And in the morning Carl found the runs, chain link bowed inward at the bottom corner, the galvanized wire pushed in, maybe 4 inches, and not torn, just leaned on, the way you might test a fence with your shoulder to see if it would give. The third week, the motion light started coming on in the dead middle of the night, with nothing in the yard. He would jerk awake at the white flood of it across the grass, and grab the rifle, and there would be nothing, the yard empty and frost-white and ordinary, and the light would tick and go off. And a minute later it would flood on again, and again nothing. Something was crossing the edge of the sensor's reach, and standing just outside it, learning where the light's eye stopped. He understood, sitting there, that he was being studied by something that could learn, and the understanding sat in him cold and low, the way the river smell had sat in his throat. He called his son. It was past midnight, and the light had just gone off for the 3rd time, and Carl found the phone in his hand and his son's name on the screen before he had decided anything. The boy's name was Daniel, and he was 36, and he sold insurance up in Indianapolis, and he had a wife and a daughter Carl had seen 4 times. And the distance between them was not anger. It had never been anger. It was only the slow drift of a man's life away from the place he was raised. And Carl had let it happen the way you let a boat drift when you are tired, and the rope is just out of reach. When Daniel answered, thick with sleep, asking what was wrong, was he all right, Carl could not make the words come out the way they were in his chest. What? He stood at the dark window with the phone to his ear and the empty white yard in front of him, and he reached for the thing that had happened, and he sanded it down as it came out of his mouth. Got an animal giving me some trouble down here, he said. Dogs are off their feed. Nothing to worry over. You sure you sound off? I'm fine. Late is all. And he heard himself making it small, planing it down to a size a sun 3 hours away could hold in the dark without alarm. And he heard Daniel take the small version and believe it, because the small version was the easy one to believe. They talked a few minutes about the weather coming and the truck Carl meant to sell and whether they would all come down at Christmas. And Daniel said he loved him sleepy, the way you say it to get off the phone and back to bed, and Carl said it back and they hung up. Carl set the phone face down on the windowsill. He had told the lie himself. No one had made him tell it. He had heard it land soft in his son's ear and do its work, and he had no one to blame for the smallness of it but his own mouth. And the loneliness came up around him. Then the way the fog came up off the bottoms, from the low ground first and then filling everything. And he sat back down in the chair with the rifle and watched the yard and let it fill. The dog he lost was the youngest beagle, and he did not lose it the way you lose a dog to a car or a snake bite with a body to bury. He lost it to an open gate. He had not left the gate open. He went over it 100 times after, and he had not left it open. He had come in at first light after a night at the window, and fed the hounds and latched the run, the spring latch he had hung himself, the kind you had to lift and turn, and he had gone into sleep, and when he came out at noon the gate stood open and the youngest beagle was gone. The other two were pressed flat to the back of their houses and would not come to him. The latch was not broken. It was lifted and turned and laid back against the post neat, the way a man would open a gate, except no man had been on that property, and the frost on the ground showed Carl his own boot prints from the morning, and no others. None, not a track in the white grass anywhere in the yard, and the gate stood open all the same. He walked the bottoms all that afternoon, calling the beagle down every deer trail along the slough, out to the river where his trot line still hung, untended in the cold water. He called until his voice went raw, the dog's name, and then the long whistle that always brought it running, and the woods took the sound and gave him back nothing, no answering bay from down in the timber. No body, no blood, no tuft of white and tan hair, caught on a greenbrier thorn. He knew how to find a dead thing in the woods. He had found plenty by the smell, or by the crows, or by the disturbed leaves where something had dragged. He found none of it. The dog was there at first light, and gone by noon. The way the smell came and went, the way the figure stood at the edge of the camera frame and would not enter it here, and then simply not, with nothing in between for a man to hold. He came up out of the bottoms at dusk with his hands empty and his throat raw and the cold settling into him, and as he reached the back fence at the head of the deer trail, he saw the collar. It was the orange one. It was hung over the bottom strand of wire, square in the path he walked every day of his life, and he stopped 6 feet from it and stood very still. It was not dropped. A dropped collar lies in the leaves where it falls. It was not snagged. A snagged collar tangles and twists. This was looped once, deliberately, over the wire, the buckle done up, hung the way a man hangs a hat on a peg, and left at the exact height of Carl's hand, in the exact place Carl could not fail to find it. He looked at it a long while in the failing light, and he did not touch it. He understood what it was, and the understanding was cold and complete. It was a thing set out for him, the way the open gate had been set out, the way the bowed fence and the learned light had been set out. It was telling him in the only language it had, that it could reach past the latch he had hung with his own hands and lift out the one thing in that run that was his to lose and carry it down into the dark and leave the buckle done up neat behind it. It was telling him it knew the difference between his dogs and his dog. It had taken the youngest. It had taken the one he would feel. He took the collar down at last and he put it in the freezer with the camera. Ward. Then he went inside and he loaded every gun in the house. The conservation office sent a man that week. Finally, a different one, older, a lean gray fellow named Hatcher who had trapped the Bottoms 40 years before he took the department job. And Carl walked him down to the head of the trail and showed him the bowed fence and the place the collar had hung. Hatcher did not say bear. That was the first thing Carl noticed, and it mattered more than anything the man said. After, Hatcher crouched at the fence and looked at the bend in the wire a long time, and he looked down the deer trail into the timber where the light was already going, and he stood up slower than he had crouched. He said he did not know what made it. He said it flat. No apology in it, a man who had spent his life naming sign and was not going to pretend with this one. He said he did not like not knowing, and Carl said that made two of them. And the two of them stood at the fence in the cold, and that was the most company Carl had had since the morning the dogs went quiet. Two men, agreeing that there was a thing in the Bottoms neither of them could name. Hatcher would not stay past dark. Carl did not blame him for that either. He had a wife in town and 40 years of sense and no reason on earth to sit a stranger's back window with a stranger's rifle. He left Carl his cell number written on the back of a feed store receipt, and he said to call if it came up to the house. And they both knew the number was the same as Pruitt's promise, a kindness that would arrive long after it could matter, and Carl took it and thanked him and meant the thanks. Then Hatcher drove out, and the tail lights went up the gravel and turned onto the county road and were gone, and the dark came down over the 20 acres the way it always did. And Carl was alone with it again, and now it was full dark, and it was at the fence, and it knew the way to the run. The nights ran together after that. He stopped keeping the notebook, because there was nothing new to write, only the same things closer. The smell at the back door now, some nights where it had been at the slough a month before. The motion light tripping in a rhythm on and off and on, that he came to understand was not the thing crossing the sensor by accident, but the thing standing in the yard moving just enough to hold the light on, letting Carl see the flood of empty grass, knowing Carl watched. The dogs silent more than they were not. He moved the two hounds into the mudroom at night, against every rule he had ever kept about dogs in the house, because he could not stand the thought of the run, any more the neat latch, the orange collar on the wire. He sat at the back window with the .30 -30, and he did not sleep, and the Bottoms breathed down the grade in the dark, and he waited for it to make the last short move it had been building toward. Fence to run to yard to door, and he knew it would come, and he did not know what he would do when it did, and the not knowing was the worst of all the things he carried. It came on a night near the end of November, with a hard frost and no moon, and it came up to the house. He heard it before the light caught it, and what he heard was the sound the files had no name for, the sound he had been told about once by an old man at a coon hunt years ago and had dismissed as drink talking. A low bass rumble that he felt in the floorboards through his boots before he heard it in his ears, and worked up through the rumble a higher chattering vibration. Two pitches at once out of one source, the way no animal Carl knew could make sound, like two throats laboring in one chest. It came from just off the back step. The dogs in the mudroom did not bark. They screamed, once the both of them, and then went dead silent, and pressed themselves into the corner behind the deep freeze. And Carl stood up out of the chair with the rifle coming up, and he reached over and hit the inside switch that threw every light he had, the motion flood, and the backyard went white as noon. It was standing at the foot of the steps, 12 feet from the door, and for one held breath he saw it whole. He had hunted his whole life, and he made himself look the way you make yourself look at a wound. Cataloging. Because cataloging was the only thing that kept the panic from taking him. It stood upright on two legs, and it was tall. Taller than the door it was facing. Its head higher than the top of the frame. And it was covered in hair that lay matted and dark and wet-looking. The shoulders were heavy and set wrong, too far forward, and the arms hung long and ended in hands that were not hands. The fingers too many, jointed and tipped dark. The head was long through the muzzle and low through the brow, and the ears stood up off the skull, and the eyes, when the light hit them, threw it back amber gold. 2 coins of cold fire set wide, wider than any face Carl had ever sighted down a barrel at, and the eyes were not afraid and were not startled and did not run. They held on him. They were measuring. He understood in that one white second that it had come up to the house to see him the way he had spent the month trying to see it, that the studying had run both directions all along, and that it had decided something, and that the decision was the reason it had let him turn on the lights. He did not remember raising the rifle the rest of the way. He found it